talk about this bad boy, shall we? My name is Jennifer. I'm a native English speaker who specializes in Czech literature. I'm hardly alone. There are, God, at least a dozen of us out there. But that means that there's one book from my field that a lot of people I know have read. There's that one main intersection, and that is Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And I'm not mad about it. I think it's pretty cool that there's even one Czech book that has this kind of a foothold in the English literary world. But the thing is, it's a strange book that's not even that representative of Czech literature. It's not funny enough to be representative, let's be blunt here. But it is a great book, and a slippery one that rewards close reading, rewards rereading, and with a little extra context, I think you'll enjoy it even more. This is a deep dive focusing mainly on the book itself, the English translation by Michael Henry Heim, and I'll be adding some cultural details as we go, details about the traumatic events of 1968, about Kundera's literary obsessions and resentments, his lying narrators, and some Czech responses to this novel that were not exactly favorable. You can't really spoil this book. It's non-linear and tells you in advance what's going to happen to the characters, but if you want to go in knowing nothing, you can save the video for later. Cards on the table. When I first read this, it was a favorite book. I was enamored with it. I would read certain passages aloud to my long-suffering friends and be like, it's brilliant, like it's just brilliant. Then I reread it in my early 30s and I was like, huh. Not ugh, you know, just huh. Because I was kind of amused and alarmed to notice just how much I hadn't noticed, how much more there was to appreciate and to question. You could say that my second reading had all the drama of disillusionment, which incidentally is a very Kunderian theme. But with this third read, everything began to balance out. The central event of The Unbearable Lightness of Being is the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. The 1960s were this dynamic period when Czechs and Slovaks were experimenting with a more liberal style of communism. It was referred to as socialism with a human face, something looser and less repressive than the grim and purge-filled period of the 1950s. January of 1968 was the beginning of something called the Prague Spring. Such an evocative name, right? It's when the leader of the country, Alexander Dubček, spearheaded certain liberalizing political reforms. And it was an enormous shock in August of that year when the Soviet Union and its satellite states invaded Czechoslovakia with tanks to put a brutal end to the Prague Spring. You don't get to have your own style of communism, is essentially what this was. It was a crackdown, and its effects would last for 20 more years. Milan Kundera published his first novel, The Joke, in 1967, and it really was a sign of the times that he even could publish it uncensored in that window. But the invasion happened the following year, and by 1975 he'd had enough. He emigrated to France. 3 years after that, he was stripped of his Czech citizenship, and The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which was published in 1984, would be the second to last novel that he originally wrote in Czech instead of French. It was a big surprise to me years ago when I first studied in Prague, and I asked some Czech friends about Kundera, and they said, well, I mean, he's really a French novelist, isn't he? This book is structured in an Anna Karenina style with two sets of lovers. We have Tomas and Tereza and Sabina and Franz. Anna Karenina crops up a few times, but it seems to be a bit of a red herring. I think of it more as another minor Russian invasion in the book. It's not actually that big of an influence on The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and you can see a small sign of that in the fact that Anna Karenina is told in 8 parts and Unbearable Lightness is told in 7. Kundera used to say that he couldn't escape the number 7 in his work, that he found anything written in 8 parts deliberately unnatural. I mentioned 4 characters, but our main character is the narrator, and it's this interplay of the narrator and the characters that's the special Kundera sauce. In his essay in 7 parts called The Art of the Novel, Kundera discusses the importance of both form and story, that a story on its own doesn't make a good novel. It needs a conscious kind of architecture. Here the unnamed narrator is the architect, who tells us 40 pages in, oh, just so you know, I made these characters up. They each came to me as a representation of an idea. Kundera uses a technique he calls meditative interrogation, where the narrator grabs hold of an idea, which is then blended into a character's story, which is then blended back into the bigger idea. Here's an example of this meditative interrogation. This was one of my favorite passages when I was 21, and many a person heard this from me. It begins with Tomas feeling unsure if he's falling in love with Tereza and if he wants to commit himself to her. He remained annoyed with himself until he realized that not knowing what he wanted was actually quite natural. We can never know what to want, because living only one life, we can neither compare it with our previous lives nor perfect it in our lives to come. Was it better to be with Tereza or to remain alone? There is no means of of testing which decision is better because there is no basis for comparison. We live everything as it comes, without warning, like an actor going on cold. And what can life be worth if the first rehearsal for life is life itself? Einmal ist keinmal, says Tomas to himself. What happens but once, says the German adage, might as well not have happened at all. If we have only one life to live, we might as well not have lived at all. People throw around the phrase book of ideas, but that's a literal description in Kundera's case. Around the publication of Unbearable Lightness, he was interviewed by Ian McEwan for Granta. His responses were translated from French by Ian Patterson, and it's an interesting interview in which you get a sense of Kundera's precise relationship with language, by which I also mean a sense of how pedantic he was. Later in the 80s, he actually stopped giving interviews entirely, presumably because he was tired of being the only correct person in a room. Anyway, in this conversation, he said, I need to hear in the novel the voice that is thinking, but not the voice of a philosopher. The narrator is trying to work his way through paradoxes, contradictory and surprising realities that coexist. Unbearable Lightness plays with certain conceptual pairs, the main one being lightness and heaviness. We also have fidelity and betrayal, strength and weakness, recurring events and events that happen only once, body and soul. The book inflates each of these idea balloons and then tethers them to the characters. So Tereza becomes the anchor of the body and soul pair. She's a woman who's always wished she could embody her soul without the humiliation of a body and all its functions. Franz is a character who's portrayed as physically strong, but in such a useless way that he actually seems weak. Those sorts of things. And you can spot these fixations from the beginning of Kundera's work. In his first novel, there's a sentence that reads, I strode across those dusty cobblestones and felt the heavy lightness of the void that weighed on my life. It's the absence of something or someone heavy or light. An absence, a lack, is both, really. But how can something be both heavy and light? Like I mentioned earlier, the novel has a non-chronological structure where scenes recur and are retold from different perspectives. It's a musical structure with re-emerging notes and motifs. And you can tell that this is one of the joys for Kundera, is taking our largely linear experience of life and writing it out in this non-linear way that's both jumbled and elegant, writing life in a way we can't live it other than in a novel. And I know this is all probably sounding increasingly abstract, but trust me, it reads like a dream. I'm building a sandwich structure here. First, we're going to talk about our secondary lovers, Sabina and Franz, then we'll really get into the narrator, and finally we'll come back around to our primary couple, Tereza and Tomas. The narrator section is where we'll go through the autopsy of my 21-year-old reading, but I want to start with Sabina and Franz because for me, they're my favorite part of the book. Sabina is one of Tomas's many lovers. She emigrates to Switzerland and becomes the mistress of a professor, Franz. There's this striking section about them called A Short Dictionary of Misunderstood Words. We're told that while people are fairly young and the musical composition of their lives is still in its opening bars, they can go about writing it together and exchange motifs. But if they meet when they are older, like Franz and Sabina, their musical compositions are more or less complete, and every motif, every object, every word means something different to each of them. The book goes through some of these words, like woman, music, cemetery, to show how their separate lives have led them to diverging understandings of these words. In my opinion, Sabina is the narrator's favorite character. She's a subversive visual artist who represents a lot of the tensions of emigration and of how her country is misperceived abroad. Franz romanticizes the struggle of Czechoslovakia. He thinks that by superimposing the painful drama of her country on her person, he found her even more beautiful. But Sabina has a real distaste for being forced to play the role of the noble Czech exile. Yeah, Sabina has this interesting edge to her, and she's definitely given the benefit of complexity. In contrast, you should know that this book hates Franz. This narrator wants Franz to die in a ditch, and I'm almost speaking literally. And that's because symbolically Franz is Europe. Free, feckless, Western Europe. He's a good-looking, kind, accomplished guy, but mainly he's meant to be a paradoxical combination of masculinity and impotence. Franz laments how boring his life in Geneva is, and Sabina is like, what are you talking about? All I want is what you already have. It's living and working in peace, the luxury of boredom. Here's something it's helpful to know when you're reading the character of Franz. In 1984, the same year that he published The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Kundera also published an essay called The Tragedy of Central Europe. Actually, the original French essay came out the year before, I think, but in 1984, the English translation by Edmund White was published in the New York Review of Books, and it was a bit of a sensation. I have a mild obsession with this essay, so I'll keep myself on a tight leash. In The Tragedy of Central Europe, Kundera suggests that countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary in particular had very little in common culturally and historically with Russia, and by extension with the rest of Eastern Europe. They had a lot more in common with Western Europe, he argued. The major difference being that they were small nations that had had a lot more difficulty in preserving themselves. And because of this, they cherished European liberal values even more than those outside the Iron Curtain who got to experience them but took them for granted. Again, this is all Kundera's framing. I've studied a lot of theories of Central Europe and think Kundera is a talented writer and a lousy historian. There's a key moment in this essay when Kundera describes what happened when he emigrated. I arrived in France and tried to explain to French friends the massacre of culture that had taken place after the invasion. Try to imagine, all of the literary and cultural reviews were liquidated, every one, without exception. That never happened before in Czech history, not even under the Nazi occupation during the war. Then my friends would look at me indulgently with an embarrassment that I understood only later. When all the reviews in Czechoslovakia were liquidated, the entire nation knew it and was in a state of anguish because of the immense impact of the event. If all the reviews in France or England disappeared, no one would notice it, not even their editors. And I think if you read or reread Unbearable Lightness, you'll see how this bitterness about Europe's complacency and about its abandonment of a country like Czechoslovakia influences the characterization of our poor buddy Franz. It really is a fascinating aspect of this book. Okay, back to our narrator, because here's where we really get into some things that baby me did not pick up on. Like a lot of people, I'm seduced by first-person narration and by articulateness generally, and as a younger reader, I was a lot more inclined to trust the kind of narrator who's perched above the story. We tend to talk about unreliable narrators in the Lolita mold, a character who's involved in the story and has some kind of a personal agenda, but a narrator like the one in The Unbearable Lightness of Being exposes my gullibility a whole lot more. At 21, I just believed this voice, this disembodied intelligent voice. Yeah, turns out there were at least 3 major things I was missing, 3 hilariously important things: grand narratives, irony, and bullshitting. This narrator employs the techniques of grand or master narratives, overstating, oversimplifying, glossing over details, ignoring counterbalancing evidence, all in the service of creating an overarching theory of the world. The rhetorical impact of a grand narrative can be significant. A writer who used this to great effect was Aimé Césaire, the anti-colonial essayist. His discourse on colonialism is a tremendous piece of writing that I recommend for its insights and also for his style, which is large, declarative, polemical. He's such a rhetorical force that questioning him can feel prohibitive. This type of authoritative voice can steamroll you. Kundera vehemently opposed grand narratives. He actually saw the novel as the opposite of a grand narrative, because one demanded complexity while the other relied on simplicity. So you might not be expecting it, but this narrator purposefully mimics the techniques of grand narratives. It's designed to mess with you. He will blatantly overstate and oversimplify. A classic case is saying there are 2 kinds of people, this kind and this kind. Not let's posit that there's a certain divide or let's engage in this train of thought. Just here are the 2 kinds of people in the world. The narrator will also say things like, well, we all have this experience, when the experience in question is hardly universal. There are these broad claims that can't be substantiated because they're not meant to be. Kundera's toying with you. Are you just going to go along with this? Are you taking me at my word? The second overlooked element of this narration is its finely honed irony, which Heim does a very nice job of preserving. I want to be careful here not to exoticize Czech literature too much. I had an interesting conversation with an editor from Karenina Press, which does a lot of work publishing Czech books for a foreign audience, and this editor said to me that he really doesn't like when people have the attitude that, oh, you know, foreigners just can't get our humor. There are a lot of cultural specifics, of course, but most of it can translate. I believe that at least. The issue is that English speakers use concepts like coincidence and satire a lot more than we use the Czech version of irony, which is that you say one thing and mean its opposite, or that you expect one thing to happen and the opposite occurs. I'm fine with people using the term irony in the Alanis Morissette way. It's all good. Language is flexible. But that meaning won't help you understand this narrator's blend of shrewd surprise and of mocking sincerity where he both does and doesn't mean what he's saying. There's just that raised eyebrow to everything. I can't raise my eyebrows individually. I have to do it manually. There. And you can tell that Kundera employs and enjoys this in part because irony challenges the compulsory seriousness of totalitarian ideology. Jacob Ikonovsky provides a useful framework for this in his article called Goodbye Eastern Europe, which went on to become a book. He says, in the Western European novel, characters move along a magic square defined by the four poles of ambition, desire, propriety, and adultery. The American novel, by contrast, has generally depicted men and women confronted by a space of freedom and a scale of opportunity that overwhelm the smallness of their identity. Eastern European fiction, by and large, has been about the capriciousness of fate, the inescapability of history, and the general absurdity of life. It has been shaped by a history of sudden reversals, thwarted ambitions, and unhappy surprises. In fact, the Eastern European legacy of domination, repression, and unexpected terror is so deep and has affected its authors so profoundly that it has bled into their very idea of consciousness and sense of narrative form. The third big element is maybe the most underhanded, and it's the way that this narrator actually just make stuff up. One example is when we're told that living in truth is the formula set forth by Kafka somewhere in the diaries or letters. Franz couldn't quite remember where, but it captivated him. Kafka did write about the relationship between life and truth, but I mean, I couldn't find this phrasing of it in Kafka's work, and I think I remember my professor saying the same. However, I didn't have to go looking for this phrase to know that its main association is with the Czech playwright and future president Václav Havel and his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, which was hugely influential. And famously, Kundera and Havel didn't see eye to eye on certain topics like the efficacy of protest and of ordinary people living in truth. So this is my speculation, but I suspect that this is actually a fake Kafka quote that was meant as a Havel dig. If Kundera can say whatever he wants, then so can I. The most egregious case of bullshitting involves a section about the death of Stalin's son, Yakov Djugashvili. He died as a Soviet prisoner of war in 1943, and as soon as I read this section, I said to myself, I'm about to look this up and learn that these details aren't true. Not only did I find that these historical facts were anything but, I also found a fantastic article by Jan Čulík called Mystification as an Artistic Strategy in Milan Kundera's Work. I found someone who was speaking my language. I strongly recommend this article, and it's short, only 12 pages. To give you a taste, Čulík says that Kundera uses a technique of confusing the reader with highly convincing false facts, and that he liberally distorts a given historical event to make it conform to and reinforce the philosophic assertions he is trying to disseminate. Kundera is only too aware of Western European audiences' ignorance about societies outside Western Europe. When pretending to present facts about Eastern Europe to the Western reader, Kundera may be making fun of them. Overall, it's interesting to me that so many younger readers gravitate toward this book. I know a lot of people who discovered and loved this in their teens and 20s, and who maybe took its philosophizing at face value. It's like the back of the book. Knowing what I know now, it's almost amusing to see this earnest quote taken out of context. I really think that for Kundera, his ideal reader is someone who's older and much more cynical. Let's talk about Tomas and Tereza, the Anna and Vronsky of the Unbearable Lightness of Being. In the major 19th century adultery novels, adultery is heavily stigmatized. I mean, that's the point of it all, that it sets a character apart from the normal flow of society. And it also often compromises that character's parenting. The adulteress as bad mother is a common figure in this body of literature. The Unbearable Lightness of Being is a novel about Tomas's continual adultery, but it doesn't have any of those characteristics. The conflict is only between the husband and wife. And that's partly because the adulterer is a man, and also because of changing sexual mores in the 20th century. I mean, the fact that they get married is treated as incidental. To assuage Tereza's sufferings, he married her. They could finally give up the broom, which she had not lived in for quite some time, and gave her a puppy. Their marriage gets half a line, and the whole next page is devoted to the puppy. But this type of adultery without societal consequences is mainly a result of the book's priorities. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression that these characters are purely ideas. I mean, I always end up crying in the final section, which I'm embarrassed to admit because it does feel like it's playing on my readily available emotions, but I can't help it. I do get invested. Generally, though, these characters function as ideas in the sense that, unlike people, they can't work to change their fundamental circumstances. Tomas loves only Tereza. Tereza loves only Tomas, but he views sex and love as separate concepts, and she can't. Tomas openly and repeatedly sleeps with other women, even though this hurts Tereza, and even though Tereza's pain is very painful for him. They're stuck in this unresolvable loop because the narrator is using their situation to explore paradoxes of fidelity and betrayal. That's why certain basic solutions never occur to Tomas. He doesn't try to be faithful, or even to sleep with fewer women. He just putters along, all the while thinking, God, I wish Tereza weren't so miserable. We're not actually problem solving here. We're existing within the problem so that we can examine it. This is where the presence of Sabina and her escapades helps somewhat, because Tomas and Tereza on their own are quite stereotypical representations of male and female sexual values, and it is nice to see a woman sowing her 20th century oats, but I have to say that Sabina isn't a completely mitigating factor when it comes to gender. My Czech lit professor Christopher Harwood put it really well. He's read this maybe dozens of times now, has taught it many a year, and he said that the question he asks himself is, do women ever get on top in this universe? Consistently, the answer is no. Metaphorically, literally, this novel's universe can't conceive of a woman being on top. If you've read Kundera's other work, you probably won't be surprised to hear that. And for how much he writes about sex and desire, he's quite limited in this capacity. I've always felt that he explores sexuality and eroticism like a zoo animal explores its enclosure. Unlike Tomas, who gets to have many an apolitical affair, Tereza's one foray into betrayal when she decides to sleep with someone else is woven into this storyline about mass surveillance and informant culture. Where the secondary lovers plot focuses on broader ideas about Europe and about emigration, the primary lovers are the ones who go through certain shared experiences of those who stayed in Czechoslovakia after 1968, things like the wiretapping of intellectuals, the consequences that people experienced for speaking or writing against the regime, the relative powerlessness of dissidents and their protests, which Kundera characterizes as a sort of feebleness. Here's where the Czech response to the unbearable lightness of being gives us some different food for thought. The Czech literary critic Milan Kundera describes this duality of Kundera's reception abroad versus at home. He says that in the West, Kundera's bestsellers are received without the slightest critical doubt and with a fame bordering on mass hysteria, whereas in the Czech context, a lot of Czech underground readers had more tepid and more complicated responses to his novels. Jungmann is very complimentary of Kundera's abilities, but is critical of his intent. He calls out his intellectual bravado and his mistrust of the reader, and he cynically refers to him as our world-famous novelist. He also points out misrepresentations of the reality of life in 1970s Czechoslovakia. For example, Tomáš loses his job as a surgeon after writing a semi-political letter, and he's forced to become a window washer. But as Jungmann notes, this couldn't have happened. Even disgraced doctors didn't become window washers. There was actually an official ban on doctors leaving their profession. And the book portrays the countryside as this refuge from the city, completely ignoring the fact that surveillance was more severe in the countryside. But foreign readers would be led to believe the opposite. Personally, I have two main takeaways from this. How do I want to say this? The first is that Jungmann wasn't alone in his assessment that since his debut, The Joke, which was critically acclaimed at home, Kundera's thinking and his writing had lost depth and seriousness. That Kundera's own disillusionment about his communist past and his desire to break from that past had led him to reject any strongly held personal beliefs and to embrace artfulness and jokes at the expense of deeper meaning. And it is noteworthy that Unbearable Lightness is still treated abroad as a serious book about the 1968 invasion, when a lot of Czech readers thought that Kundera made light of everything, that he became more and more artistically incapable of earnestly portraying how bad life could be. The second takeaway is that The Unbearable Lightness of Being is a case study of the pitfalls of one author coming to represent a nation, and that's not a responsibility that Kundera wanted for himself. But I understand the undercurrent of frustration in Jungmann's essay. Manipulating truth was a freedom that Kundera saw as essential to the art of the novel. Authors have to be allowed to make stuff up, right? But in this case, this was the portrait of Czechoslovakia that ended up traveling abroad, and it was all interpreted as factual. This happens with various translated novelists, and it's a real-life, potentially unresolvable issue because our awareness of this dynamic can't necessarily help us avoid it. I mean, other than by amplifying additional writers. I do appreciate this paradox about Kundera, my own Kunderovsky paradox, that there was nothing he took more seriously than writers and their work, because it was through their work that they could confront what he saw as the fundamental unseriousness of life. You know, I wanted to make all these perspectives accessible because this is my field and because a lot of what I've shared isn't typically a part of English speakers' understanding of this novel. And Kundera is a thorny character for me. I'm sure that came across, but I think that's healthy, you know? He was a human being. But I don't mean to imply that you can't approach this book on your own. I mean, I think it's actually the fact that this book does carry readers along so easily and is so engaging that made me want to pause and reflect on it all. So I think it goes without saying that I recommend this book, and I hope this video contributes to your reading. Thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and I'll see you soon for another video.